Mr Chair. I'm coming to part two, which, as my colleague Carmel Cipollone mentioned, amends the Education Act 1989 and also ensures via a number of technical amendments that adjustments made as part of the legislation doesn't allow duplication and CPI adjustments. I just want to come to that point because if I'm reading part two correctly, via using the regulatory impact statement, it talks about the way that generally within the bill, benefit indexation and the annual CPI adjustments will apply to this new $25 increase. And I just want to reflect on the statements made in the regulatory impact statement, which at para 193 states, annual increases to benefit rates to reflect upward movement in the consumer price index were legislated for in 2010, occurred prior to that by convention, a point I think is important to make. So we legislated that CPI adjustments would be made to benefit rates in 2010. The bill does not amend the legislative requirement that base benefit and student allowance rates, which are talked about in part two, must be adjusted by any upward percentage movement in the CPI. So it doesn't change that legislation. There was some discussion, as discussed in the summary. Actually, I think it's a departmental report I'm referring to, excuse me, rather than the regulatory impact statement. It states indexation to wages or relative to rates of New Zealand superannuation as proposed by some submitters is outside the scope of the bill. We accept that. The bill does, however, include benefit and student allowance provisions that specify the consumer price index treatment of the $25 from 1st April. And this is the bit where it gets interesting, on 1 April 2016, the $25 increase is effectively added after the annual CPI increases to the base benefit and allowance rates are applied. This means that on 1 April 2016, the relevant benefit or student allowance base rate as at 31 March is increased to reflect annual CPI. The additional $25 is then added to form the new base rate. So for the next CPI adjustment that we have, on the 1st of April 2016, our base rate adjustments will occur, and then the $25 is added to that base rate. So the $25, when it first is added, will not have a CPI adjustment made to that $25 addition. Why is that? That seems like a bit of hair splitting to me. If the $25 is meant to be an increase to the base rate, make it to the base rate straight off the bat and give the whole thing a CPI adjustment. Because if the CPI adjustment is meant to reflect increases in cost of living, then why would we exclude the increase in the base rate from that? When already I think it's fair to say that the $25 increase should have happened at the time it was announced rather than projecting it out to the 1st of April 2016. To then add insult to injury and not have that adjusted as part of the CPI adjustment seems a little Scrooge-like from my perspective. I'd be really interested to hear from the Minister what difference that made into the overall cost of the package. I mean, we already know that that $25 is affected by a range of other deductions. Surely, the government could have been generous enough to at least just allow that $25 to be included in that CPI adjustment, if it is indeed a part of a base benefit rate. And we certainly know that the government has crowed about the fact that they call this the first benefit increase in however many years, putting aside the fact that it's actually incorrect. First significant benefit increase. The first significant benefit increase was via the family tax credit as part of the Working for Families package. That was the last generous increase to benefit rates. It might have had a different name, but it had the same effect. So if it's truly a base increase, then I would have thought that the government wouldn't need to be quite that Scrooge-like. Interested in the Minister's response to that. But as part two obviously is talking again about the interaction between these different payments, CPI adjustments and so on, I think it was also worth pointing out Some of the wider interaction between, Mr. Chair.
Jacinda Ardern.
Some of the wider interaction between benefit provision, particularly for sole parents, and our student allowance regime. Now, credit where credit is due. The government has made some tweaks to the interaction between the student allowance regime and sole parent benefits to remove some of the anomalies. And I want to say to the government that was a good thing to do, because we did have a situation for a while there where if you were one of the people affected by Part 2 of this Act, if you were in receipt, you were a sole parent, but you were in studies, so you were in receipt of a student allowance, your access to accommodation support was less generous, thus incentivising you to be on a sole parent payment. Then some of the regime around sole parents regime changed. It meant that you couldn't really study, particularly and be on that regime, so it then forced you back onto that less generous support. So good that some of the accommodation changes have been made in that area to remove those anomalies. But I would still like to point out, but for the group of people who are affected by Part 2, who are in the category of being on student allowance and might be in receipt of this base benefit increase, that is people who are in study and have children. You know, we do still see a situation where, for instance, families, parents who are eligible for benefit support but are studying have work testing requirements on them which are just unrealistic and do not take into account the longer term benefit for taxpayers, let alone for those families. Now, let me give you an example. I had a case brought to my attention not too long ago of someone who was in study. They were studying to be a nurse. They'd been in part-time work and on a benefit and realised that at that rate they were going to be on benefit for a very long time and that wasn't of use to her child, or to the state. So transitioned into study, was able to still be in receipt of benefit, but the work and income pulled her in one day and said, look, we found part-time work which you are obliged by virtue of the age of your child to be in, regardless of your study, and which we would like you to take up. She pointed out that that part-time work, which from memory was in hospitality, clashed with her coursework, meaning she would be unable to continue with her studies. Based on the legislative requirements for that particular individual, she was required to take up that part-time work obligation and withdraw from her study. Now, if we took a longer-term view, and for this bill in particular, that is what we would advise, Mr. Chair, that for those individuals who are captured by student allowance payments or in part-time study or what have you, that we take the longer-term view that allows the discretion to say, regardless of any of the obligations set out in Part 1, if you are in study, we take a broader view. That if, for instance, we find some hours that the law actually would require you need to work, say in dishwashing, and that happens to clash with some study that you're doing that in 2 years' time will mean you're not reliant on a benefit at all, then we will take some leniency to those situations. Because if the ultimate goal is to have someone independent, some of these part-time service industry jobs won't necessarily lend themselves to that. And at that point, you know, we're in a position where we're cutting off our nose to spite our face. And if the longer term goal is hardship and children in hardship, we know that well-paid, decent, stable work is the goal, not just work at any cost. Because we know there are a number of jobs where there is a significant amount of cross-subsidy going on by the state to sustain people at an income level that means that they're able to support their children and to support their family. So in summary, Mr. Chair, Part 2, yes, it is a fairly minor act and part of the bill. The number of people who are covered by it are an interesting cohort that deserve greater discretion, but actually what they also deserve is a CPI adjustment to their base benefit. And their base benefit, as argued by the government, is meant to now include that extra $25. So why don't we treat it like that from the beginning and not just at a designated year that is convenient for the government to prescribe, Mr. Chair.